You're nothing but a pathetic warehouse dog. Let me strip the shame of this family for everyone to see. Julian, my billionaire brother-in-law, roared like a rabid animal. He lunged, grabbing the collar of my shirt and yanking hard. Right! The sound of tearing fabric shredded the dead silence of the shooting range. The shirt gave way, sliding down, exposing my bare back to the mocking stares of the elite and military brass. My own mother stood there, covering her mouth with a smirk. My father looked away in utter disgust. They relished seeing their daughter stripped of her dignity. I didn't fight back. I didn't shed a single tear. I just stood dead still, letting the biting mountain wind blow against the massive black ink suddenly exposed on my flesh. And then the laughter abruptly died. A 4-star Pentagon general shot up from his seat, his authoritative face drained of all color. He shoved past 3 bodyguards, stumbling down to the dirt, his eyes locked on my back in absolute horror. Nobody in my family knew that what they were laughing at wasn't just a tattoo. Before I tell you what my mark is, take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you really like this story. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from. 48 hours before my shirt was ripped open, I drove my rusted 2008 Ford F-150 through the wrought iron gates of a luxury Catskill resort. The truck's transmission kicked and whined. It was a jarring sound against the backdrop of pristine pine trees and parked Porsches. The valet attendant looked at my front bumper like it was a biohazard. I tossed him the keys. He didn't catch them. Inside the grand dining hall, it was a sea of crystal chandeliers, silk and cloying designer perfumes. The room reeked of old money pretending to be new and new money desperate to fit in. I walked in wearing a faded gray t-shirt, dark denim, and scuffed boots. My sister Chloe glided past me in a backless emerald gown. She flashed me a winner's smirk, her eyes raking over my clothes, the golden child in her natural habitat. I didn't blink. I walked toward the entrance to check the gold-plated seating chart. There it was. A thick red Sharpie line struck violently through my name. Alicia Carr, crossed out, erased. My mother Margaret stood by a towering ice sculpture across the room. She caught my eye. Her jaw tightened under layers of expensive makeup. She didn't walk over to greet her youngest daughter. She just flicked her wrist. A dismissive swat in the air, pointing toward the far back corner of the room. The staff section. I didn't argue. I didn't let out a heavy sigh. I picked up a flimsy plastic plate from a side stack, walked right past the sterling silver settings of my family's table, and sat down at a folding table near the kitchen double doors. My dinner companions were 2 off-duty security guards and a busboy. I pulled my chair out and sat facing the room. My eyes automatically scanned the layout, clocking the primary and secondary fire exits, counting the blind spots behind the heavy velvet curtains, measuring the distance between the main table and the nearest cover. Old habits. My silence always pissed them off. My family fed on drama. They wanted me to beg, to cry, to throw a fit so they could point their manicured fingers and call me unstable. When I didn't give them the reaction they craved, they had to force the issue. Marcus Thorne, one of Julian's slick-haired business partners, a guy who wore heavy tactical gear to the driving range but probably couldn't change a flat tire to save his life. He swaggered toward my corner, holding a full glass of deep red Merlot. He didn't even try to make it look like an accident. Marcus stepped into my personal space, tilted his wrist, and dumped the entire glass straight into my chest. The freezing liquid hit my collarbone and soaked through my cheap cotton shirt instantly. The sharp smell of alcohol and fermented grapes hit the back of my throat. Red stained the gray fabric, dripping down my stomach and pooling onto my jeans. "Oh man, my bad, lost girl," Marcus slurred. He flashed a set of oversized porcelain veneers. "This isn't a soup kitchen, you know. You should watch where you sit." A ripple of cruel laughter erupted from the VIP tables behind him. Chloe was giggling into her champagne flute. Julian slapped his buddy on the back. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp from the cold. I kept my right hand resting on the table, my fingers lightly holding a plastic fork. The cheap styrofoam plate in front of me hadn't moved a single millimeter. My breathing stayed flat, 65 beats per minute. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The crowd suddenly parted. Richard, my biological father, marched over. His face was flushed red, but not with anger at the man who had just humiliated his flesh and blood. He stopped 2 feet from me. He didn't offer a napkin. He didn't punch Marcus in the jaw. Instead, he raised his hand and shoved his heavy gold wedding band right into my face. His eyebrows pulled together in pure, unadulterated disgust. "Don't cause a scene in here, Alicia," he hissed. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and cowardice. "Apologize to Uncle Marcus for dirtying his shoes, right now." The words hit my eardrums, but they didn't penetrate. I looked at the man who shared my DNA. He was willing to publicly sacrifice my dignity just to keep a billionaire investor nodding in approval. A massive, suffocating silence expanded inside my chest. It wasn't grief. It was the final heavy click of a steel vault locking shut. Tears are a luxury I left behind in basic training. I didn't cry. I didn't speak a single word. Slowly, I placed the plastic fork down on the table. My hand didn't shake. These same hands had pressed combat gauze into the blown-out arteries of bleeding men in Syria. They had held the weight of human lives slipping away in the dirt. My family had no idea how much blood these hands had actually seen. I reached over and pulled a single dry paper napkin from the dispenser. I wiped the dripping wine from my collarbone. One mechanical swipe. Then I looked up. My eyes bypassed my father completely and locked onto Marcus. I didn't glare. I didn't scowl. I just looked at him. A dead flat stare that mapped the exact distance to his carotid artery. A sniper's laser painting a target in the dark. Marcus's arrogant smile froze. The color drained from his fake tanned face. His spine went completely rigid. He instinctively took a half step back, his brain suddenly registering that he had just poked a creature that didn't belong in a petting zoo. I tossed the soggy, blood-red napkin aside. I picked up my plastic fork, stabbed a cold piece of meat from my plate, and chewed. Slow. Deliberate. They could stain my shirt. They could banish me to the shadows with the help. But they couldn't even scratch the armor inside my head. I swallowed the meat and kept my eyes deadlocked on Marcus. The real game hadn't even started yet. The morning sky over the Catskills was the color of a bruised rib. It hung heavy and gray thick with the smell of wet pine and damp earth from the overnight rain. The mountain air was sharp, biting at the exposed skin on the back of my neck. Julian decided his corporate retreat needed a team-building exercise. He called it a tactical ruck march up the ridge. In reality, it was a fashion show for cowards. The parking lot was full of people playing soldier. Julian and his elite business partners were wrapped in thousands of dollars of crisp, unwrinkled Gore-Tex jackets. They wore heavy-duty tactical boots that had never touched anything rougher than a paved driveway. They strapped on hydration packs that had never seen a drop of real sweat. They were a walking billboard for stolen valor. Then there was me. I wore a pair of faded woodland camo pants frayed at the hems and a standard gray thermal shirt. My boots had actual miles on them. I walked right in the middle of the pack. I kept my stride perfectly even, heel to toe. My heart rate sat at a steady 65 beats per minute. Breathe in through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. There was no wasted movement. I conserved every single calorie. Right behind me was my sister Chloe. She sounded like a punctured bellows. She was gasping for air, her lungs burning, cursing under her breath every time her brand new Prada hiking boots sank into the wet soil. "This is ridiculous," she hissed between heavy, ragged breaths, slapping at a mosquito. "I'm getting mud all over my clothes. This is disgusting." We reached a steep, narrow switchback near a dry ravine. The ground here was pure, slick clay. The rain had turned the trail into a nightmare of loose rocks and deep sludge. I planted my left foot. I shifted my weight forward to make the climb. That is when she moved. Chloe lunged forward with unexpected speed. She swung her reinforced toe directly into the back of my right ankle. She targeted the Achilles tendon. It was not an accidental trip. It was a calculated, vicious strike. The sudden force shattered my center of gravity. My ankle buckled inward. The ground dropped away beneath me. I was falling forward toward the jagged rocks of the ravine edge. Instinct took over before conscious thought even registered the betrayal. I tucked my chin hard against my chest. I brought my forearms up to protect my face and rolled my shoulder forward to absorb the heavy impact. A standard combat break fall. I hit the ground hard. I slid face first into a deep, stagnant puddle of thick mud. Freezing, foul-tasting sludge shot straight up my nose. It coated the right side of my face and soaked immediately through the chest of my thermal shirt. The cold hit my skin like a sheet of solid ice. The smell of rotting leaves, wet worms, and stagnant water filled my lungs. A sharp burst of electronic static sliced through the mountain air. Julian had set up a small observation deck at the top of the ridge, complete with a portable PA system to bark orders at his employees. "Ha ha! Look at that!" Julian's voice boomed over the cheap speakers. The sound was distorted, echoing through the pine trees. "I guess the warehouse girl finally found where she belongs. Keep scrubbing the dirt, little sister. That is all you are good for." Cruel laughter erupted around me. The corporate crowd stopped their whining to point down at the trail. I turned my head. The thick mud sucked loudly at my cheek. To my right, parked comfortably on a flat ridge under a canvas canopy, was a customized Jeep Rubicon. My parents were sitting in the heated leather seats, safe from the cold wind. My mother, Margaret, had a thermal coffee mug in her hand. She raised her free hand to cover her mouth. She was smirking. Her eyes looked down at me with pure, unfiltered disdain. She looked at me the exact same way she looked at a stray dog digging through her garbage, an absolute embarrassment to the pristine Carr bloodline. My father did not even flinch. He just shook his head in disappointment and took a slow sip of his black coffee. They watched their own daughter bleed in the mud, and they felt absolutely nothing. My right knee throbbed with a sickening rhythm. The sharp edge of a buried rock had sliced right through the fabric of my pants. It bit deep into the old jagged scar tissue on my kneecap. I got that scar dragging a wounded heavy gunner across a street in Fallujah while bullets chewed up the asphalt around my head. I bled for my country. Now I was bleeding because my spoiled sister threw a tantrum. Blood mixed with the cold brown mud. I clamped my jaw shut. I boxed up the physical pain, shoved it into a dark corner of my mind, and threw away the key. I placed both of my hands flat in the freezing muck. I pushed myself up. I did not grunt. I did not groan. I stood up perfectly straight. Dirty water dripped from my chin and fell onto my boots. Chloe stood exactly 3 feet away. She crossed her arms, a nasty little smile playing on her lips. She was waiting for me to cry. She was waiting for me to snap and start screaming so she could play the innocent victim in front of the crowd. I did not give her the satisfaction. I raised my right hand. I dragged 2 fingers through the thick patch of mud on my cheek. I pulled the dark, wet sludge in a straight, horizontal line across my forehead. A single, deliberate stripe. A scout's camouflage. A declaration of war. I lowered my hand and locked eyes with my sister. I did not say a single word. I just let the dead, suffocating pressure of my stare hit her chest. The smug little smile instantly melted off her face. The air between us turned to solid ice. Chloe actually took a step backward. Her expensive boots slipped in the dirt. Her eyes widened. She saw something in my face that terrified her. I broke eye contact. I turned my body forward. I locked my eyes onto the crest of the hill. I started walking. My stride was longer now, faster, completely mechanical. I did not look back. 10 minutes later, the pathetic sounds of the elite complaining faded entirely into the wind. I left every single one of them in the dust, marching straight toward a target they could not even see. Let them laugh. The real test was waiting at the top. The afternoon sun baked the loose gravel of the outdoor tactical range. The air was thick, smelling of burnt cordite and the sharp chemical sting of Hops No. E9 gun oil. Julian stood behind a heavy steel workbench. He was surrounded by his deep-pocketed investors and the absolute VIP of the weekend, General Arthur Sterling. Julian was sweating through his expensive olive-drab combat shirt. He was putting on a show for the brass, a timed field strip of a standard AR-15 rifle. It was painful to watch. Julian grunted, his thick protein powder-fed fingers fumbling with the rear takedown pin. He had to grab a loose bullet from the table just to use the brass tip to push the pin through. Amateur. His breath was heavy, his shoulders tense. The metal clattered awkwardly against the steel table as he finally yanked the bolt carrier group free. He slammed it back together, catching the fabric of his tactical glove in the dust cover. He cursed under his breath, ripped the glove free, racked the charging handle, and slapped the table to stop the clock. The digital timer beeped. 1 minute and 58 seconds. The investors clapped on cue, nodding like they had just witnessed a masterclass in combat readiness. Julian puffed out his chest. He dragged the back of his hand across his forehead, wiping away a thick bead of sour sweat. He looked out at the crowd, soaking in the unearned praise. Then his eyes landed on me. I was standing quietly in the back, leaning against a wooden post. A nasty superior smirk crawled across his face. "All right, warehouse girl," Julian called out, his voice booming over the PA system. He pointed a thick finger right at my chest. "Come on up here. Let's see how fast you polish the inventory for the real operators." A low chuckle rippled through the crowd of executives. Chloe rolled her eyes. I pushed off the wooden post. I did not move fast. I did not look intimidated. Before I could take a second step, a heavy hand clamped down hard on my left bicep. Thick fingers dug right into my muscle. Richard, my biological father. He leaned in close, blocking my path. I could smell the stale black coffee and the sharp bite of alcohol on his breath. "Listen to me, Alicia," he hissed. His voice was a tight, ugly whisper meant only for my ears. His grip tightened, bruising the skin. "Do not embarrass your brother-in-law in front of the general. You get up there, you fumble it, and you get out of the way. Do you understand me? Don't make a scene. Know your place." I stared straight ahead at his throat. A father ordering his own blood to play the fool, demanding I humiliate myself just to protect a rich man's fragile, paper-thin ego. It was pathetic. With him, it was always about protecting the asset. Julian was the asset. I was just the liability. I did not nod. I did not argue. I just twisted my left shoulder, breaking his grip with a sharp, fluid jerk that threw him slightly off balance. I stepped past him and walked toward the cold steel table. I did not look at Julian. I did not look at the general. I looked at the black metal resting on the table. Julian stepped aside, crossing his arms, a mocking grin plastered on his sweaty face. He hit the reset button on the timer. 0. My hands hovered over the rifle. My brain severed the connection to the crowd, to my father's glare, to the Catskill wind. The switch flipped inside my head. The tactical numbness took the wheel. Beep. My hands dropped. Thumb on the rear takedown pin. Push. Pull. The upper and lower receivers snapped open on the hinge. Pull the charging handle. Extract the bolt carrier group. Slide the firing pin retaining pin out. Drop the firing pin into my palm. Remove the cam pin. Pull the bolt straight out of the carrier. It was a blur of black steel and gun oil. I did not look down at the table. I did not need to. My eyes stayed fixed on the dark tree line behind the paper targets. My fingers knew the exact geometry, the weight and the tension of every single spring and groove. I laid the parts out on the table. A perfect squared grid. Not a fraction of an inch out of place. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Reverse order. Grab the bolt. Slide it into the carrier. Insert the cam pin. Drop the firing pin down the channel. Retaining pin in. Slide the entire bolt carrier group and charging handle back into the upper receiver. Snap the receivers shut. Push the takedown pins home. Click. Snap. I grabbed an empty magazine from the table. Slap it into the mag well. Rack the charging handle. Squeeze the trigger to drop the hammer. Click. I laid the rifle flat on the steel table. I took half a step back. The digital clock flashed red. 52 seconds. Dead silence hung over the firing range. The only sound was the wind kicking up dust around our boots. Craig Harrow, Julian's head of training and a former Marine, stood with his mouth slightly open. He looked at the timer, then at the perfect scratch-free rifle on the table, then back to the timer. "Where the hell did you learn to do that?" Harrow stammered, taking a step forward, completely forgetting his boss was standing right there. I wiped a small smudge of gun oil onto the thigh of my camo pants. My voice was flat, deadpan. "I practice in the warehouse," I said. Julian looked like he had been hit in the face with a wet brick. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The mocking grin was completely gone, replaced by a deep, blotchy red that crept up his neck. He looked around at his investors. Nobody was clapping for him now. But at the far end of the table, General Arthur Sterling did not look at the timer. He did not look at the reassembled rifle. The old wolf leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. He narrowed his gray, weathered eyes. He was staring dead at my hands. They were resting loosely at my sides, completely relaxed. Not a single tremor, not a drop of sweat. He knew. That level of economy, Sterling muttered almost to himself, his voice a low gravel. That is Tier 1 steadiness. He smelled the blood in the water. He sensed the monster hiding inside the warehouse uniform. Julian stood frozen, his fake empire taking its first real structural hit. But I knew exactly how a weak, insecure man reacts when his pride gets publicly fractured. He does not fight fair. He does not try to get better. He goes straight for the blind spot. And tomorrow morning, we were supposed to climb the mountain. Julian was humiliated at the firing range. You do not publicly humiliate a man with a fragile ego and a fat bank account without paying a tax. The tax came the next morning. Julian orchestrated a high-altitude survival hike. He wanted to break me physically. While the corporate elite stuffed their faces with eggs, Benedict, and imported coffee in the resort dining room, I waited by the staging area in the cold fog. When I picked up my olive-drab military rucksack from the dirt, my shoulder muscles instantly locked. It was wrong. The weight was completely wrong. A standard day hike pack should sit right around 30 pounds. This bag was pushing 80. Someone had tampered with my gear. Julian had slipped a $50 bill to one of the resort staff. 2 massive, jagged landscaping rocks were shoved at the very bottom of the main compartment. I knew it instantly. I did not complain. I did not call him out. I threw the heavy canvas pack over my shoulders and pulled the nylon straps tight. The extra weight immediately dug viciously into my left shoulder blade. It sat right over a thick, jagged knot of scar tissue. 3 years ago, a piece of mortar shrapnel ripped through my flesh when I threw my body over a bleeding local interpreter in a combat zone. A stranger owed me his life. Now the rough nylon sawed back and forth against that old wound with every single step up the Catskill incline. I felt the warm, sticky pull of fresh blood seeping into my thermal shirt. I kept my mouth shut. I used the physical pain. I turned it into a hammer. With every heavy crunch of my boots on the loose gravel, I used that hammer to smash whatever pathetic, lingering loyalty I still held for the people sharing my bloodline. The pain was clarifying. It burned away the fog of family obligation. We hit the halfway point at a flat clearing overlooking the valley. The air was thin and freezing. The VIPs immediately dropped their lightweight day packs. They broke out bags of artisan beef jerky and expensive Cliff Bars, complaining loudly about the humidity ruining their hair. I sat alone on a gray boulder on the edge of the clearing. My back burned. The blood had dried and crusted against the fabric of my shirt. Jenna Hayes walked over. She was Chloe's shadow, a woman who measured her entire self-worth by the price tag on her activewear. She held a large green apple in her manicured hand. She took a loud, wet bite, chewing with her mouth half open. She swallowed, looked down at me, and let out a short nasal laugh. Then she tossed the chewed-up apple core right at my chest. It bounced off my collarbone, leaving a smear of saliva on my shirt, and landed in the loose dirt right at the tip of my combat boots. "Eat up, Tick," Jenna said. Her voice was shrill, grating against the quiet mountain wind. "Better grab it before your mother tells us to starve you for the rest of the day." I did not look down at the dirt. I lifted my chin and looked straight across the clearing. My mother, Margaret, was sitting on a canvas folding chair 20 feet away. She heard every single word. She saw the trash hit my chest. She deliberately turned her head away, lifted her hand, and started inspecting her fingernails. That was it. The final thread snapped. The vault in my chest did not just lock. It froze solid. I leaned forward. My joints popped loudly in the cold air. I reached down and picked up the apple core. Fine dirt and small grains of sand clung to the wet, chewed flesh of the fruit. The entire rest stop went dead silent. The crunch of expensive hiking boots stopped. The chatter died. Every eye turned toward my corner. I brought the core to my mouth. I took a bite. The apple was sour. The mountain dirt crunched loudly between my molars. I chewed slowly. I swallowed. I took another bite. I kept my eyes locked dead on to Jenna the entire time. I did not blink. The smug, nasty smile melted off her face like wax held to a flame. The artificial color drained completely from her cheeks. The sheer unnatural indifference of my action broke her brain. She realized in real time that she was not bullying a weak warehouse girl. She was standing in front of a creature that did not care about her rules of social humiliation. I finished the apple core, down to the seeds. I tossed the tiny stem back into the dirt. I planted my boots and stood up. I did not wince at the tearing sensation in my bleeding shoulder. I walked straight toward Jenna. She stood frozen in the dirt path. I did not alter my course. I clipped her right shoulder with mine. I did not lean into it, but the sheer density of a conditioned military operator colliding with a woman who survived on iced lattes and Pilates was mathematically unfair. Jenna lost her balance instantly. She let out a sharp gasp, stumbling backward and falling hard onto her backside in the dirt. I did not look down at her. I kept walking. I stopped right in front of Julian, Chloe, and my parents. The smugness was entirely gone from Julian's face. He looked suddenly very small inside his expensive jacket. I reached up to my collarbone. I popped the quick-release buckles on my rucksack. I let the heavy nylon strap slide off my shoulders. I did not lower the bag gently to the ground. I just let it drop. Crash! The bag hit the rocky dirt with a deafening heavy thud. The ground actually vibrated under our boots. The sound of two massive boulders grinding and cracking against each other inside the canvas echoed sharply off the pine trees. Julian flinched hard, his eyes darting to the heavy bag. My father swallowed tightly, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. I looked Julian dead in the eye, a cold, flat stare. I turned my back to them, letting the fresh, dark blood stain on my shoulder blade be fully visible to the entire crowd. I started walking back down the mountain trail alone. The endurance game was over. I was done playing the victim. Marcus Thorne thought he was being stealthy. It was past 2 a.m. The camp was dead quiet except for the wind rattling the nylon tents. He crept toward my designated spot on the outer perimeter, clutching a cheap folding knife. He probably planned to slash my guy lines, collapse the tent, and laugh while I struggled in the dark. It was the kind of pathetic frat boy prank guys like him considered a tactical victory. What Marcus did not know was that I do not sleep like a civilian. Years of combat deployments rewire your brain. I sleep in a state of hyper-aware REM. The crunch of his boots on the pine needles woke me before he was within 20 feet. I did not reach for a weapon. I did not need one. I unzipped the tent flap exactly 2 inches. The moonlight caught the reflective tapetum in my eyes. I stared at him through the narrow black slit. A dead, unblinking glare that pierced right through the dark and locked directly onto his retinas. Marcus froze. He dropped the folding knife in the dirt. I heard the sharp, sudden intake of his breath, followed by a quiet, wet sound. The tough guy actually pissed himself. He backed away slowly, hands raised like he was surrendering to a ghost, and then turned and ran back to his luxury cabin. It was a warning, a quiet physical boundary. But these people were too arrogant to read the signs. The next morning was the crown jewel of Julian's retreat, the 400-meter sniper qualification. The range was carved into a long, flat stretch of the valley. Steel electronic targets sat at the 400-meter mark, hooked up to a digital scoreboard on the VIP observation deck. Julian handed me a custom-built AR-15. It was heavy, outfitted with a high-end variable optic scope. He shoved it into my chest with a nasty, confident smirk. "Let's see if the warehouse girl can actually shoot," Julian mocked. Behind him, Chloe stood with her arms crossed, shivering slightly in the morning chill. She popped a piece of gum and rolled her eyes. "I bet she does not even know how to seat the stock," Chloe sneered loud enough for my parents to hear. My mother chuckled. My father looked at his watch, completely disinterested. I walked up to the firing line. I did not speak. I dropped straight to the dirt, laying flat on my stomach. I spread my legs to anchor my hips. I pulled the rifle tight into the pocket of my shoulder. My cheek welded to the stock. I opened my right eye and looked through the glass optic. It took me exactly half a second. The brain of a woman who survived sniper overwatch operations in the mountains of Kandahar processes geometry, differently. The reticle inside the scope was dead center, but the turrets had been messed with. The windage was dialed exactly 2 degrees to the right. Sabotage. It was a dirty, cowardly trick. At 400 meters, a 2-degree shift meant every single shot I took would miss the steel target, completely flying wide into the dirt berm. They wanted me to pull the trigger miss 5 times in a row and walk off the line looking like an incompetent fraud in front of General Sterling and the investors. I did not lower the rifle. I did not complain to the rangemaster. I did not ask for a different weapon. If you complain, you lose. You work the problem. I closed my right eye. I blocked out the optical illusion completely. I let my other senses take over. I felt the cold Catskill wind bite at my left cheek. I calculated the speed. Maybe 10 miles per hour, full value from the left. I felt the heavy humidity in the air weighing down the morning fog. I deleted the scope from the equation. I relied entirely on muscle memory. The deep, ingrained physical knowledge of how the barrel aligns with the target. I shifted my hips a fraction of an inch to the left, manually compensating for the sabotaged zero. I used pure instinct. I inhaled deeply, pulling the cold air down into my stomach. I locked my ribcage. I let out half a breath and held it. The natural respiratory pause. My heart rate slowed to a steady, heavy thud. I placed the pad of my index finger on the trigger. I squeezed. Crack. The recoil punched into the bruised tissue of my shoulder. I did not lose my sight picture. The bolt slammed back, loading the next round. Crack, 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 crack. 5 shots, no hesitation, no pause to check the impact. Just a brutal rhythmic string of fire tearing through the morning fog. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled my nose. Downrange, a sharp electronic beep echoed back across the valley. The digital scoreboard above the VIP deck lit up in bright, flashing red. 5 hits. Dead center mass. The graphic on the screen showed the impact points. They were not just hits. They were a single jagged, overlapping hole right in the black heart of the target. A cluster so tight you could cover the entire group with a single silver quarter. The arrogant chatter on the observation deck died instantly. Carter Julian's overpaid civilian rangemaster jogged over to my firing position. He grabbed the rifle from the mat. He looked through the optic to check the zero. His face went chalk white. He looked at the dial, looked at the target 400 meters away, and then stared down at me with wide, terrified eyes. He knew the scope was dead. He knew what I had just done was mathematically impossible for a civilian. Up on the deck, the silence was deafening. Julian's jaw was practically resting on the floor. But it was General Arthur Sterling who broke the silence. The 4-star veteran gripped the metal railing of the observation deck so hard his knuckles turned white. His eyes were wide, fixated on the screen, completely ignoring Julian. Tier 1. Sterling muttered, his gravelly voice carrying in the quiet air. That is impossible. I stood up from the dirt. I brushed the dust off my camo pants. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I looked right past Julian and walked off the firing line. The toys were broken. It was time for him to try something stupid. The humiliation at the sniper range broke something deep inside Julian's fragile, protein powder-fueled brain. You can strip a rich man of his money, and he will get angry. But if you strip a fake tough guy of his illusion of dominance in front of other men, he becomes desperate. Julian was out of dirty tricks. He was out of technical challenges. He needed to re-establish the pecking order the only way a coward knows how, through sheer brute physical force. After lunch, Julian cleared the schedule. He ordered the resort staff to drag thick, interlocking rubber puzzle mats into the center of the main staging tent. The air inside the canvas tent was stifling. It smelled of hot plastic, stale sweat, and cheap energy drinks. Julian stood in the center of the black mats wearing a tight compression shirt that showed off every hour he spent doing bicep curls in an air-conditioned gym. He weighed an easy 220 pounds, pure bulk, no functional mobility. He cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing in the heavy air. He looked past the crowd of nervous investors and pointed a thick, meaty finger directly at me. "You!" Julian barked. The fake, polite corporate tone was gone. His voice was a harsh, ugly growl. "Get on the mat. We are doing a close-quarters combat evaluation. I'm going to show these gentlemen what real pressure looks like." A low murmur rolled through the crowd. I was at least 70 pounds lighter and a full head shorter than him. This was not a sparring match. This was an execution. He wanted to break my collarbone to teach me my place in his world. I didn't move immediately. I looked at the people standing around the edge of the rubber mats. I looked at my family. My mother, Margaret, stood near the front row. She didn't look horrified. She didn't step forward to pull her son-in-law back. She just crossed her arms over her expensive cashmere sweater and gave a slow, approving nod. Richard, my biological father, took a step closer to the mat. His face was flushed. "Get up there, Alicia!" Richard yelled, his voice cracking with misplaced authority. "Stop hiding in the back. Let Julian teach you a lesson. Maybe he can knock some actual sense into your head." I shifted my gaze to my sister. Chloe was already holding her brand new iPhone. Horizontally, the camera lens pointed squarely at me. A bright, gleeful smile stretched across her face. She was recording. She wanted to capture the exact moment her billionaire husband crushed her embarrassing blue-collar sister into the rubber floor. She wanted to watch it later. They wanted to see my bones snap. They needed to see me bleed to prove that their twisted plastic reality was correct. I unlaced my combat boots. I kicked them aside. I stepped onto the black rubber mat in my bare feet. The material was warm and slightly sticky. I walked to the center, stopping exactly 4 feet away from Julian. I did not raise my hands. I did not drop my hips into a fighting stance. I just stood there. My arms hung completely loose at my sides, zero muscle tension. In a physical confrontation, tension equals fear. Amateurs tense up. They clench their jaws. They raise their shoulders. It burns oxygen and slows down reaction time. I gave him nothing. I stood as relaxed as if I were waiting for a bus. That absolute dead silence infuriated him. Julian's face turned a violent shade of purple. The veins on his thick neck pulsed. I stopped looking at him like a human being. I deleted the title of brother-in-law from my brain. My pupils dilated, absorbing the harsh overhead light. My peripheral vision expanded. I broke him down into a purely biomechanical equation. A hostile target, weight 220 pounds. Center of gravity, too high. He carried all his mass in his chest and shoulders. Stance too wide. His lead foot was planted heavy, making it impossible for him to pivot quickly. Breathing shallow, rapid mouth breathing. He was already burning adrenaline before the fight even started. He was not a fighter. He was just a heavy, loud punching bag. Carter, the range master, stood at the edge of the mat holding a silver whistle. He looked at General Sterling, then at Julian, sweating profusely. On the whistle, Carter stammered, raising the metal to his lips. Clean engagement. Time slowed down to a thick, heavy crawl. I watched the muscle in Julian's heavy jaw twitch. I saw the exact moment his brain decided he was going to lunge. I know exactly what it feels like to stand completely alone while the people who are supposed to protect you cheer for your destruction. If you have ever had a toxic family member try to tear you down just to make themselves feel big, I need you in my corner right now. Hit the like button, subscribe, and type "Stand your ground" in the comments if you are ready to see me tear his fake empire apart. Shriek! The whistle blew. A sharp, deafening sound that cut through the stifling air of the tent. Julian roared. It was a guttural, ugly sound of pure, unchecked ego. He dug his heavy sneakers into the rubber mat and launched all 220 pounds of his body weight directly at me. He didn't throw a punch. A punch can miss. A punch can be blocked. He went for absolute, degrading control. He reached out with both of his massive, sweaty hands, aiming straight for the fabric of my collar. He wanted to grab me, lift me off my feet, and slam me into the rubber. I did not blink. I did not take a single step backward. I kept my arms loose by my sides, planted my bare feet firmly against the mat, and let the monster close the distance. You are nothing but a pathetic warehouse dog. Let me strip the shame of this family for everyone to see. Julian roared. The sound was guttural, raw, and desperate. He didn't throw a punch. He reached out with both of his massive, sweaty hands and grabbed the collar of my thermal shirt. He planted his heavy sneakers into the rubber mat and yanked backward with all 220 pounds of his chemically enhanced muscle. Reap! The sound of tearing fabric shredded the dead silence of the staging tent. The heavy cotton gave way. The collar split down the middle. Julian kept pulling, ripping the shirt right off my shoulders. The fabric slid down my arms, snagging for a split second before pooling at my elbows. The cold, Catskill mountain wind whipped through the open flaps of the tent. It hit my bare back, biting at my skin. I stood there half naked in front of 100 elite investors, military contractors, and my own blood relatives. My mother, Margaret, actually chuckled. She put a hand over her mouth, her eyes gleaming with sick satisfaction. Richard looked away, shaking his head in disgust like I had brought this on myself. Chloe held her phone steady, recording every second of my humiliation. They wanted me broken. They wanted me to drop to my knees, cross my arms over my chest, and cry. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach up to cover myself. I didn't shed a single tear. I just stood dead still on the black rubber mats. I let the cold wind blow against the massive black ink suddenly exposed on my flesh. Then the shift happened. The silence turned heavy, suffocating. Chloe's cruel little smile froze. The phone in her hand slowly dipped toward the floor. The sneers on the faces of the corporate VIPs vanished. The air got sucked right out of the room. Every single eye in the tent locked onto my bare back. They were looking at the ink. It started at the base of my neck, stretched wide across my shoulder blades, and coiled all the way down the center of my spine. It was not a cheap parlor tattoo. It was not some delicate, trendy piece of art. It was a massive, aggressive strike of pure black ink. A ghost viper. Coiled tight, its fangs sunk deep, crushing a human skull. It was brutal. It was terrifying. And to 99% of the civilian world, it was just a scary piece of ink on a rough girl. But General Arthur Sterling was not a civilian. Up in the VIP section, the 4-star Pentagon commander shot up from his seat. Crash! His heavy wooden chair tipped backward and slammed hard into the concrete floor. The sound cracked like a gunshot. The color drained completely from Sterling's weathered face. The wrinkles around his eyes deepened into lines of pure horror and absolute recognition. "Move!" Sterling barked. 3 private security guards stepped in his way, instinctively trying to protect the VIP. Sterling didn't even pause. He shoved a 200-pound guard aside with the brute force of an old infantryman. He stumbled down the metal bleacher steps, his eyes wide, glued to my back. Julian stood a few feet away, panting, holding the ripped shreds of my shirt in his fist. He looked at the general, expecting a pat on the back. "See, just white trash," Julian sneered, trying to keep the bravado going. Sterling didn't even look at him. He walked right past Julian like the man was a ghost. The general stopped at the edge of the black rubber mat exactly 3 feet behind me. He straightened his spine, his shoulders squared. The old wolf pulled his chin back. Crack! Sterling snapped his leather heels together. He raised his right hand, keeping his fingers perfectly straight, and brought the tip of his index finger to the edge of his gray brow. A full, formal military salute. He was a 4-star general of the United States Armed Forces, and he was saluting a 26-year-old girl standing barefoot in torn clothes. The entire tent stopped breathing. My father's jaw dropped. Margaret's hand fell away from her mouth, her eyes wide with total confusion. "Who?" Sterling's voice actually shook. Not with anger, with absolute, unfiltered awe. "Who gave you permission to wear that mark, soldier?" I didn't turn around. I didn't pull my shirt up. I let them look at the snake. I let them look at the skull. "I didn't ask for permission," I said. My voice was flat, cold, the sound of deep water. It was burned in by Commander Ghost Viper himself. "I am a Corps operative for the Joint Special Operations Command." Sterling's hand trembled slightly before he dropped the salute. He took a slow, deep breath, turning his head to look at my family. He looked at Richard. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the fake billionaire standing in the center of the mat. "Do you people have any idea what you are looking at?" Sterling's voice boomed. It wasn't a question. It was a sentence. "That ink is not bought. It is earned in blood. The person wearing that mark is a top-tier night assassin. She is the absolute heart of the United States military." The words hit the room like artillery shells. My mother staggered backward. Her high heel caught the edge of a floor mat, and she had to grab a metal pole to keep from falling. She clutched her chest, staring in absolute terror at the daughter she had treated like garbage for 2 decades. Richard dropped his silver-tipped walking cane. It clattered against the floor, rolling away into the dark. The man who had ordered me to fail just to protect his son-in-law suddenly realized he had been spitting in the face of a living weapon. The corporate investors backed away from Julian. They physically distanced themselves from him. Julian's empire was burning to the ground in real time. The social order of the Carr family was reduced to ash in under 60 seconds. But Julian was too stupid to stay down. The humiliation was too loud. His brain couldn't process the shift in gravity. He looked at the torn shirt in his hand, looked at the general, and his face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. He dropped the fabric. He clenched his massive right fist. The coward was gearing up for one last desperate swing. The humiliation at the sniper range broke something deep inside Julian's fragile, protein powder-fueled brain. He was a man who bought his toughness. He bought the tactical gear. He bought the gym memberships. He bought the security company. In his mind, reality was something you could purchase and bully into submission. The idea that the quiet, worn-down warehouse girl standing in front of him was an apex predator broke his artificial reality into a million jagged pieces. He looked at the torn fabric in his hand. He looked at General Sterling. Then the embarrassment mutated into pure, unfiltered rage. "You senile old fool," Julian spat, pointing a thick, trembling finger at the 4-star commander. Saliva flew from his lips. "She's a liar, a warehouse rat. You think I'm going to let some glorified inventory clerk make a fool out of me in front of my investors?" Sterling didn't even flinch. He just looked at Julian like a man watching a bug crawl across the pavement. That look pushed Julian over the edge. He let out a raw, guttural roar. He dropped the shredded fabric of my shirt. He planted his heavy cross-training sneakers into the rubber mat and launched himself forward. He didn't use technique. He didn't try to grapple. He wound up his massive right arm, throwing a blind looping haymaker aimed directly at my left temple. He put every single ounce of his 220 pounds into that swing. He wanted to crack my skull open. He wanted to put me in the hospital to salvage his bruised ego in front of the corporate elite. 10 seconds ago, my father had cheered for this. My mother had smiled. They wanted to see me broken. I didn't step backward. I didn't raise my hands to block. The heavy, suffocating mask of the obedient scapegoat was gone. I watched the knuckles coming toward my face. Time dragged to a heavy, sluggish crawl. I read the telegraph of his shoulder. I read the heavy, flat-footed plant of his lead leg. When the fist was exactly 3 inches from my cheekbone, I moved. I didn't jump. I just slightly tilted my neck to the right. The massive fist sailed past my ear. I felt the cold displacement of air whip across my skin. At the exact same fraction of a second, I stepped forward and offline. A clean 45-degree pivot on the ball of my left foot. I slipped right under his extended arm, gliding behind his back like a shadow. Julian's own aggressive momentum carried him forward. He stumbled, completely overextended. His chest leaned heavily over his front knee, exposing the absolute worst blind spot a fighter can leave open. His back. I didn't hesitate. My left arm snaked up and under his thick, sweaty chin. I drove the blade of my forearm deep into his throat, sliding it across until the crook of my elbow locked perfectly dead center under his windpipe. My bicep pressed hard against the left carotid artery. My forearm clamped down on the right. A textbook rear naked choke. The blood choke. I brought my right hand up, grabbing my own left bicep to secure the vise. I locked my right palm flat against the back of his head. I dropped my hips, lowering my center of gravity, and pulled my shoulders back. The vise snapped shut. I didn't crush his windpipe, I just pinched the artery shut. The flow of oxygenated blood to his brain was instantly severed. 1. Julian's eyes went wide with sudden animal panic. The roar died in his throat, replaced by a wet, strangled gasp. 2. He dropped his weight, trying to throw me off his back. But I was anchored tight. I kept my hips glued to his spine, riding the bucking weight. 3. His massive protein-fed arms came up. He clawed frantically at my left arm. His thick fingernails dug into my skin, scratching and tearing at the sleeve of my thermal shirt. He possessed twice my physical strength, but muscles are entirely useless without oxygen. 4. His face turned a deep, mottled purple. The veins on his forehead bulged against the skin. His scratching grew weaker. Frantic, jerky movements of a man realizing he was drowning on dry land. 5. Stop! Richard screamed from the edge of the mat. Now he wanted to stop the fight. Now that the golden boy was losing. Alicia let him go. You're killing him. I didn't look at my father. I looked at the digital clock mounted on the tent pole. 6. Julian's heavy hands fell away from my arm. His fingers went completely limp. 7. His eyes rolled back into his skull, showing only the bloodshot whites. A thick string of saliva bubbled at the corner of his lips. 8. His knees buckled. I released the lock immediately. I unwrapped my arms and took a clean, deliberate step backward. I didn't ease him down. I let gravity do the work. Julian's 220-pound body dropped like a sack of wet cement. He hit the black rubber mat face first. Thud. The sound vibrated through the floorboards of the tent. He lay there, a massive pile of useless muscle twitching slightly as his brain desperately tried to reboot. A small pool of spit formed on the black rubber near his mouth. For 3 seconds, the tent was so quiet you could hear the wind howling outside. Then Chloe shrieked. It was a high-pitched, piercing wail of absolute horror. She dropped her phone, the same phone she was just using to record my execution, and scrambled onto the mat in her expensive boots. She fell to her knees, grabbing Julian's heavy, limp shoulders, sobbing hysterically. Margaret grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him backward. They huddled together, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. They looked at me like I was a monster, a psychopath. Less than a minute ago, they had smiled while this massive man tried to cave my skull in. But the second I defended myself, the second I proved I was not their helpless punching bag, I became the villain. That is the reality of a toxic family. You are only good as long as you bleed quietly. I didn't look at my sister crying over her unconscious husband. I didn't look at my parents cowering in the corner. I looked at the group of elite corporate investors standing frozen on the sidelines. I looked at Craig Harrow, the head of training, who was sweating through his shirt. I reached down, grabbed the torn fabric of my shirt from the floor, and threw it over my bare shoulder to cover the snake ink. Physical punishment was just the appetizer. Julian wanted to play CEO. He wanted to play warlord. I walked straight past his unconscious body and headed directly toward the tactical sand table, displaying his multi-million-dollar defense contracts. It was time to burn his fake empire to the ground. Julian hit the mat and stayed there. Instinct kicked in around the perimeter. 4 of Vance Security's private guards, thick-necked guys in tight black polos, reached for the collapsible steel batons clipped to their belts. They were rent-a-cops used to manhandling drunk frat boys, not handling actual combat situations. They took half a step forward onto the rubber mat. "Stop right there!" Craig Harrow's voice cracked like a bullwhip. The head of training threw both of his arms out wide, physically blocking his own men. Sweat was pouring down Harrow's forehead, soaking the collar of his shirt. He was a former Marine. He understood the hierarchy of violence better than anyone else in the room. "Do not take another step." Harrow barked, his voice tight with genuine panic. "If you touch her, you are dead. Stand down, now." The guards froze. They looked at Harrow, then looked at me standing barefoot over their unconscious boss with the ghost viper ink exposed on my shoulder. They slowly took their hands off their batons. They backed away. They were cowards, but they were not entirely stupid. Advancing on a Tier 1 operator was suicide. I didn't give the guards a second glance. I stepped over Julian's heavy leg. I walked straight across the tent toward the glass-top tactical sand table. This was Julian's pride and joy. It displayed the digital overlay of his multi-million-dollar defense layout for overseas private contracting. It was the entire foundation of his fake empire. I picked up a thick red dry erase marker from the metal tray. I uncapped it. I pressed the heavy felt tip against the glass. Squeak! The sound of the marker tearing across the glass was loud in the dead silent tent. I dragged a thick red line straight through Julian's primary defensive perimeter. Squeak! I slashed another line through his secondary fallback point. Squeak! A heavy X right over his sensor array. I tossed the marker. It clattered against the metal frame of the table. I pointed a bare finger at the ruined map. "Your left flank is completely blind," I said. My voice carried clearly across the room. "The sensor grid is angled 3 degrees too high. It creates a 50-foot dead zone right under the tree line. This entire defensive perimeter would collapse in exactly 3 minutes under sustained medium-range fire. It is a death trap. I turned my head and looked directly at Chloe. She was still kneeling next to Julian, her makeup running down her face in ugly black streaks. "Your great husband is a hollow drum," I told her. The words were completely empty of anger, just cold, hard facts. "He is an amateur peddling defective garbage to the military." General Arthur Sterling stepped up beside me. He looked down at the red ink on the glass, then looked at the crowd of nervous corporate investors standing near the exit. "The Pentagon is officially pulling all security clearances and contract evaluations for Vance Security," Sterling announced. His voice was absolute iron. "I do not do business with frauds, and I certainly do not fund men who attack American soldiers." The sentence was a guillotine. You could almost hear the sound of Julian's stock plummeting to zero. The investors started backing toward the tent flaps, whispering frantically to each other, already pulling out their phones to dump their shares. The multi-million-dollar empire evaporated into thin air in less than 10 seconds. The reality of the financial ruin hit my parents before anything else did. Richard staggered backward. His knees literally gave out. He collapsed onto a folding chair, burying his face in his hands. He wasn't crying because I had been attacked. He was crying because his access to the Billionaire Country Club had just been revoked. Margaret broke. She shoved past a security guard and stumbled toward me. Her face was a frantic, pathetic mask of desperation. "Alicia. Baby." Margaret wailed, her voice high-pitched and completely artificial. She reached both of her hands out, her diamond rings catching the overhead light. "We didn't know. We are so sorry, honey. Please, you have to talk to the general. You have to help the family." She used the word family. 10 minutes ago, I was a warehouse dog. Now that I held the keys to the kingdom, I was family. She lunged forward, trying to grab my arm, trying to pull me into a hug. I took one single step backward. I looked at her hands hovering in the empty space between us. I looked at them like they were covered in a highly contagious disease. The disgust in my eyes was so pure, so absolute that Margaret physically recoiled. She dropped her hands to her sides, her mouth hanging open. "Do not touch me," I said quietly. The silence that followed was heavier than the rocks in my rucksack. No one moved, no one spoke. Then the ground beneath our feet began to vibrate. It started as a low rhythmic thudding in the distance. It grew louder, faster, shaking the canvas walls of the staging tent. The deafening roar of heavy rotor blades tore through the Catskill sky, drowning out the sound of my mother's pathetic sobs. The vibration started deep in the dirt. It crawled up through the soles of my bare feet and settled right inside my ribcage. A low, heavy, rhythmic thudding. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound bounced off the Catskill mountain ridges, growing louder by the second. The chaotic noise inside the staging tent, the frantic whispers of the investors, the pathetic sobbing of my mother was completely swallowed by the approaching roar. A massive shadow blotted out the afternoon sun. A matte black UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter cleared the tree line. It did not circle politely. It flared hard, bleeding speed and dropped directly toward the manicured lawn just outside the open flaps of the tent. The rotor wash hit the ground like a physical bomb. A violent hurricane-force downdraft tore through the resort. Expensive patio umbrellas snapped backward and flew into the trees. Catered folding tables flipped over. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the concrete. The corporate elite screamed, covering their faces as thick clouds of dust, loose grass, and debris blinded them. I didn't close my eyes. I didn't cover my face. I stood on the rubber mat and let the wind hit me. Through the flying dirt, I saw my father Richard squinting into the storm. A pathetic, desperate spark of hope actually flashed across his face. In his deeply delusional mind, he probably thought the military was sending a VIP detail to salvage Vance Security. He probably thought this was a rescue mission for Julian's contracts. The Blackhawk's tires hit the grass with a heavy settling crunch. The rotors slowed, but the engine kept screaming. The side door slid open. General Thomas Reed stepped out into the dust, the commander of JSOC, Ghost Viper. He didn't wear a dress uniform with shiny medals. He wore faded combat fatigues, scuffed tactical boots, and a plate carrier. The raw, suffocating authority radiating off him made the wealthy men in the tent look like scared little boys playing dress-up. Richard immediately puffed out his chest. He wiped the dirt off his designer blazer plastered on his fake country club smile and stepped out of the tent. He actually reached his hand out to greet the man. "General Reed, an absolute honor. I am Richard Carr, Thomas did not break his stride. He did not look at Richard. He did not acknowledge the outstretched hand. He walked right past my father like the man was a piece of trash blowing in the wind. Richard's hand hung empty in the air, his fake smile freezing into a mask of pure humiliation. Thomas stepped onto the black rubber mats. The cold, lethal hardness in his eyes vanished the second he looked at me. He stopped 2 feet away. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't look at the unconscious pile of meat named Julian bleeding on the floor. He just looked at my bare, shivering shoulders. Thomas unzipped his heavy OCP field jacket. He pulled it off and wrapped it around me. The thick canvas covered the Ghost Viper ink on my back. It smelled like cedar wood, gun oil, and safety. It was heavy. It was warm. It was the first time in 26 years I actually felt protected in front of my own family. Thomas reached out and gently pulled the collar of the jacket together under my chin. "Mission is over," he said. His voice was a low rumble, barely carrying over the sound of the chopper engine. "Let's go home, my wife." The word dropped like an anvil. Wife. The silence that followed was absolute. The bomb went off, and it leveled the entire Carr family hierarchy in a fraction of a second. Margaret choked on her own breath. Richard's knees buckled again. Chloe stared at me, her eyes wide with a sickening realization. They didn't just abuse a top-tier operator. They had spent the last 2 days treating the wife of the highest-ranking Special Operations Commander in the United States like a stray dog. They had handed me their own execution warrant. Panic set in. The realization that they had thrown away a literal empire because they couldn't stop themselves from bullying the family scapegoat. "Alicia!" Richard screamed over the engine noise, taking a desperate step forward. "Alicia, wait. We are your family. You cannot just leave us like this. We can fix this." Margaret pushed past him, tears streaming down her face, reaching out toward the chopper. "Please. We love you. You are my daughter." I stopped. I turned around. I looked at the people who shared my blood. I looked at the mother who smiled when my clothes were ripped off. I looked at the father who told me to humiliate myself for a fake billionaire. I felt absolutely nothing. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. The vault inside my chest was empty. "Forgiving you does not mean I allow you back into my life," I said. I didn't yell. I just spoke the cold, hard truth. "You are done." I turned my head. Standing near the catering truck, shivering in the cold, was Emma Lynn, my 22-year-old cousin. The only person in this entire toxic bloodline who had secretly handed me a bottle of water when they forced me to sit in the corner. I caught her eye. I gave her a single respectful nod. She nodded back, a small sad smile on her face. I turned my back on the Carr family for the last time. I grabbed Thomas's hand, the calluses on his palm rubbed against mine. We stepped up into the back of the Black Hawk. The crew chief grabbed the handle and yanked the heavy metal door shut. Clack. The heavy seal cut off the noise outside. It locked out the screaming, the begging, and the fake apologies. It locked out 26 years of abuse. The Black Hawk banked hard, pulling violently up into the gray Catskill sky. I looked out the reinforced window one last time, watching the tiny, pathetic figures of my family coughing in the dirt, shrinking away until they were nothing but dust. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by respect. You do not owe your sanity to people who only love you when you are bleeding quietly in the corner. Forgiveness is for your own peace, but going no contact is for your survival. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own life, I want you to know you are not alone. Tell me where you are listening from right now in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you agree that absolute silence is the most brutal punishment you can give a traitor. Stay strong and never let them cross your boundaries again.